Banks downgraded, China in trouble. Truths are revealed as the tide goes out. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, welcome back Sam, who's been looking at what's been happening with the banks recently. How are you going today, Sam?
Great, Chris. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. So the piece today, you highlighted that we're back in that situation again where we've had some bank failures. And this isn't a new theme. We were talking about this really only a couple of months ago now. But after some bank failures then, the Feds now, they effectively came out and said that everything was fine, everything was resilient. Is that what's really going on here?
Well, if it is what's going on, then Moody's probably wouldn't have just downgraded 10 banks' credit ratings. Now, these are kind of small to medium-sized banks, but they've also put six more banks up for review, and some of these involve, for example, these includes Bank of New York Mellon, U.S. Bank Corp, State Street. So these are some pretty significant institutions.
Yeah, big
And
names, absolutely.
again, we have a credit rating agency. We just had the U.S. have its credit rating downgraded by Fitch. And now we have Moody's going after these banks. So it looks like that resilience they're talking about isn't really there.
Right. So if some of those institutions really, like you mentioned, they're names that I've heard of before. They're quite large. They're relatively big players in the space. Like they're fundamental really to the US banking system. Wouldn't they be able to get out of this? Wouldn't they have some tricks up their sleeves to be able to deal with this situation of sort of downgrades coming from institutions like Moody's?
Well, it'd be great if they did, but um, like Volcker said in 2009, the only technology banks have invented in the last 20 years is the ATM. So they don't really do anything. All they do is really just provide liquidity. And when their big boss tells them, okay, it's time to dry up some liquidity, for the excuse of inflation, they have to follow suit. And then, these banks, especially the medium to smaller ones, if they don't actually over leverage and try to compete with the bigger banks, they would just be overtaken anyway. So now they're put in the difficult situation where they're finding a really hard time to generate revenue, and the squeeze is on them as much as it is the people they're lending out money to. People are trying to get out of debt with interest rates going up, and that means
Hmm.
they're pretty much their only source of income is drying up.
And we know that that has been an ongoing problem for these banks ever since it was highlighted with those original bank failures several months ago. So this probably leads me to the next question. I've seen from what you've written there today, and generally what I've been reading, that um, there's a lot of talk. Moody's was talking about it as well, of a recession early next year. Now we've been debating for a long time where the recession, what technically defines a recession and where the recession is. But let's just say generally this idea of a recession coming next year. Besides the talking heads of doom and gloom, there's been a lot of predictions that everyone's been making. Um, have you got some measurements that you can maybe push us towards so that we can look at this a little bit deeper? This idea that recession is coming more broadly, what we can look to there, and also probably how this banking situation fits within that.
Yeah, so before we were looking at things like supply chains and imports and exports to get away from just predictions from economists. And, some might have a bias. They really want to see markets go up more. Some might want to see a crash and get in, cheaper. But if you just look at the data that's come out of China, their exports to the US and Europe each fell over 20%, over
Wow.
20%, compared to July last year. And this is the fourth month in a row that China's manufacturing sector has contracted. So again, we look at what China's doing, not what people are saying, and it looks like they're not importing as much. They're not exporting as much, and because they're not importing as much, you can see they don't plan to export as much in the next, potentially 6 months either. And that lines up with what Moody's saying is they are looking at a mild recession. Well, we'll see how mild it is
Hmm.
in early 2024.
So if we're thinking about what you've just said there, um, you're actually effectively saying that the CPI and PPI numbers out of China are probably negative. So this would run counter to a lot of the discussion that's been out there about high inflation still to come. What do you sort of think about that?
Well, look, there could be, because the definition of inflation, it's hard to keep up with. It used to mean the supply of money, and now it means prices. So, like we talked about before, there can be a moment of max pain where prices haven't even been rising to the maximum level they should be at to
Hmm.
actually, for example, you look at someone's income and you compare that to the cost of housing. Have those been keeping up? Well, absolutely not.
No.
So before the Fed even swings back and starts cutting, the cost of goods might not even be done rising yet. So here's where we get into that difficult situation of running out of liquidity. Prices are still potentially on the rise, and the the average person gets squeezed really hard. And now it's at the point where some of these smaller banks are feeling the squeeze as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you can actually have a sort of unusual. Well, I suppose that's almost stagflation, isn't it? Where you've got the negativity of the price inflation still coming through, but you've also got the economic activity falling at the same time. So there's sort of deflationary and inflationary elements at the same time, and you kind of end up the best, the not the best, definitely the worst of both worlds in that scenario.
Exactly what I was going to say. You can have the worst of both worlds,
Yeah.
definitely. It's just like the euphoria when interest rates get cut and investments start taking off, and people still have yet to feel the burden of prices
Mm.
increasing. Same exact thing in reverse.
Yep. So probably just to wrap this up, are there any, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of things there, but are there any other things, or bringing it all together, what are you really expecting to change over the next sort of that forward period ahead based on the economic environment as you see it?
It'll be interesting to see when the tide goes out what actually still stands up. So you can see some of the first things to go are companies that don't really do anything. They're just moving money around. And then you can see banks, which are, potentially highly over leveraged or don't actually have a real revenue stream except for just, creating
Mm.
money and hoping that they can, get a steady stream of income from that without too many fluctuations in interest rates. And the other thing that oftentimes happens, if you look through history, is a repricing of assets. People actually see what's of value when the money supply contracts, and you can see the price of assets uh, sometimes be repriced. For example, if you look at US debt clock right now, it looks like there's a lot of liquidity in the silver market because out of every 291 ounces of silver being traded, only one of them is actually real.
Mm.
Most of these trades are through banks or just digitally on computer screens. But if they went and tried to get their, silver out, so to speak, it wouldn't happen. So just with the liquidity on things, especially like silver, which is just so suppressed, it's similar to someone saying, "I've stockpiled enough food for a year," and then some horrible event happens like a drought, and they go and check, and they see there's only enough food for 1.2 days. That's the maths of the silver market right now.
Yeah.
There's 291x the perceived amount of silver. So how are people going to react when they find out how much liquidity or lack of liquidity there actually is in markets, like whether it's food or other assets or things like silver, which is highly controlled by big banks. And then you see these stories about big banks making these sort of stealth purchases of silver and wondering why. So I think when the tide goes out, there's going to be not too much to go after for investors. So it'll be a race for the few things of value that are actually left, namely assets.
Well, if you've only got one and a bit days, you certainly want to be in that first one and a bit days in the silver in the silver example, don't you? You don't want to be waiting till later in the year to try and pick that up if they're all gone.
And what would you do if you only had enough food for a day and you wanted most of it for yourself? Well, you tell everyone, "Oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
We have a couple hundred times what's needed." So everyone else is late to the party. And that would be the perfect thing to do. And it looks like that's what's being done with asset markets as well, such as silver and gold.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you for that today, Sam. It certainly looks like there's a lot of games being played behind the scenes, and we'll keep an eye on that banking situation because it's certainly the one to watch at the moment.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks everyone for watching. Remember, reach out with any questions or comments on the social platforms. We'll get back to back to you on those as soon as possible. That's us for this week. We'll be back on Tuesday with Alex at this stage to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great weekend, everyone, and stay safe out there.